Christ! Okay, so before I get into whatever I just watched, Reboot was an animated series produced in 1994 by Mainframe Entertainment. They were kind of pioneers of CGI at the time, and they also produced a lot of other shows you might recognize like Transformers Beast Wars and War Planet's Shadow Raiders, which I really have been meaning to do a review on for a very long time. However, Reboot has the distinction of being the very first fully CGI animated series. And yes, the CGI has not aged very well, but honestly, I think it still looks a lot better than a lot of other CGI shows that came out afterwards. If I can describe the show using an appropriate metaphor, Reboot is like an old video game. Sure, the graphics might be primitive by today's standards, but it's still a fun show to watch, and it's one of those instances where you can look past the dated graphics and see the ambition and passion that was behind it. The show only lasted for 4 seasons, but over the years it has grown a very loyal fan base, and there was a lot of talk about bringing it back at some point, but it was kind of off and on. There was a lot of, I guess, in development stuff going on with it. There was times where we heard about it, and then times where we heard nothing, and a lot of the fans were kind of kept in the dark about what was going to happen with the series. But fast forward to today, and we get the Netflix series Reboot the Guardian Code, which is half live action. Now normally I only do animation for Rob Watches, but because this is based on a cartoon and it has half CGI in it, I guess it's appropriate. You know what, this is my show and I'll do what I want, okay? So the plot of this show is that there's this hacker guy, this weird, creepy guy who wears a hoodie and he lives in a abandoned factory or something like that, and he wants to take over the world, and he's gonna do it by hacking into all these things. And he is just disgusting. I mean, this guy drinks curdled milk and eats worms. I'm not kidding. That's what happens in the show. There's a scene where he's drinking a bottle of milk and it's like all chunky and stuff. And then there's this one scene where he's putting this worm into this program or this database or something like that. And it's a literal worm they have to fight. And then he has this like maggot in his hand and he's saying some kind of profound stuff. And then he goes, "Yeah, that's our villain." But fortunately, 4 teenagers are recruited to go into the net and become guardians to stop him. They are recruited because they were really good at a mobile app game. Because as we know, mobile app games are just that powerful. They get help from an AI program called Vera, who at the end of episode 1 gets a human body and gets to go to the real world. And I really feel like that's a thing that maybe should have been introduced later on, because I've seen other stuff where similar things like that happen, and I feel like it might be a bit too early to introduce an element like that. But then, in episode 2, Hacker Guy resurrects Megabyte. Yeah, Megabyte is in this show. You know, for years and years, when they announced that they were bringing back Reboot, everybody made the same joke. Oh, they're gonna reboot. Well, I guess the joke is on us, because this isn't a reboot, it's a continuation of the series. Not only does Megabyte come back, but a lot of other characters from the show come back as well, including Bob, Dot, Enzo, and Hexadecimal. What? And they just kind of show up as if nothing had happened in the previous series. Because, if I recall correctly, Season 4 ended on a cliffhanger that was never resolved. So, I guess we're just going to forget that happened. On the live action side of this, there's a lot of high school stuff in this show. Y'all know how I feel about school shows. And it's pretty typical stuff. It's like, I gotta study for a test, and I gotta maintain, you know, a normal life while I'm also fighting evil hacker man in the net. They also do a whole bunch of things with Vera because she gets a new body, and of course, not being a human being, she has to learn how to fit in and respond correctly to things, and they do that whole shtick. The acting in this wasn't too great either. The main characters, they were okay at best, but something about when they went into the net and had to do voiceover for their CGI characters, they just sounded like they were so bored. And, well, not to criticize the CGI in this show, especially considering the source material, but it seemed like there were a lot of times when they wanted to emulate the look of the original series. However, there were times where they were using supposedly more advanced technology, and it didn't really look that much more advanced. But probably the biggest problem I had with this series was we met the user. Yes, the user from the original series, who was kept a complete mystery and left open to interpretation, was fully realized in this show, and he was just some loser living in his mother's basement. From what I've seen, it seems like he's a character that, because he kept playing the games in mainframe and because he kept losing, he developed some sort of obsession with it, and it kind of, I suppose, ruined his life. Are you kidding me? I also have to bring up the fact that he had a lot of Reboot merchandise in his room. Like, he had a t-shirt with the Guardian logo on it, and he had the action figures from the show, the actual action figures they sold to promote the show. So this raises so many questions, like, were the characters in the show, like, known to people outside of the computer? And also, the reason why we meet him is because they find mainframe. It's some sort of, like, dated computer they find in their headquarters, and they switch it back on, and this guy just runs to his computer and he goes, "Mainframe is back online, I can play games again!" And then he boots up a game and he starts playing it. So now I do have to ask, what games in 1994 required some third-party server to use? I mean, most of the games I knew about were just CD-ROM games or DOS games. You could just boot them up and you didn't need to connect to the internet. God, I have so many questions as to how this world is supposed to work, especially in comparison to the original show, but I don't even know where to begin. I can do a whole video on that alone. Alright, I'll talk about a few things that were good about the show, and yes, there were a few good things. While the acting for some of the main characters was not the best, the girl that played Vera was really good. She played her part well. Even the guy that was playing the hacker was really good as well, even though his character was completely ridiculous. The voice actor they got from Megabyte wasn't bad either. There were a few times where he sounded very close to Tony Jay. Some of the other voice actors came back to reprise their roles as well. And while I said before the CGI wasn't the best in this show, like I said, it did seem like they were trying to emulate the look of the original show, and if that was their intention, then they did a good job with it. So, in conclusion, this does not feel like a reboot show. What this actually feels like is one of those 90s shows that tried to capitalize on the success of Power Rangers, stuff like VR Troopers and Superhuman Samurai Cyber Squad, which seems to be a very appropriate comparison, even though that show is actually better. And it seemed like they tried to add in elements of a lot of other things as well, like maybe a little bit of Tron, and the comparison a lot of people like to make is to Code Lyoko, because some of the plot is very similar, right down to the nerdy kid trying to get with the AI girl, which is what they do in this show. And you should all know how I feel about Code Lyoko by now. Even a lot of stuff from some other live-action shows, like maybe they threw in a little bit from that show Mr. Robot, and I feel like they added in some CSI and NCIS, just in terms of the complete inept understanding of how technology works. And then they just sort of tied it in with Reboot, and yeah, that's Reboot the Guardian Code in a nutshell. A lot of people waited many, many years for this, and I guess this is what we get. If you've not seen the original Reboot series, I highly recommend checking it out. If you can look past the dated graphics, you might enjoy it. But as for Reboot the Guardian Code, skip it. Well, that's all I got for Reboot the Guardian Code. I promise I'll come back with an actual cartoon next time. But in the meantime, leave a comment below and let me know what you thought of it. My name is Rob, and have a wonderful day.